For centuries, the name Krupp had been synonymous with steel, cannons, and industrial might. Long before the Second World War erupted, the Krupp dynasty had established itself as one of Germany's most powerful industrial families, weaving its influence into both the economy and the nation's politics. By the time Adolf Hitler rose to power, Krupp was already a symbol of German strength, and it would become one of the most essential pillars of the Nazi war machine. This is the story of a company that supplied weapons on a massive scale, that built the very tanks and artillery which rolled across Europe, and that exploited countless forced laborers in its factories. But it is also the story of how Krupp survived the fall of the Third Reich and managed to transform itself into a global industrial corporation in the post-war world. To understand this journey, we must first go back to the roots of the Krupp family empire. The rise of the Krupp dynasty. The Krupp family's involvement in steel and weaponry stretches back to the early 19th century. In 1811, Friedrich Krupp established a small steel foundry in Essen, a modest industrial town in the Ruhr region of western Germany. Steelmaking at the time was risky, and Friedrich struggled, but his son Alfred would eventually transform the struggling business into an industrial giant. Alfred Krupp, often called the Cannon King, revolutionized steel production in Germany. By introducing advanced casting methods, he positioned Krupp as a global leader in arms manufacturing. The family slogan, Krupp Stahl, Krupp Steel, became famous worldwide, standing for quality and durability. Throughout the 19th century, Krupp supplied weapons to monarchs and emperors, making fortunes during the wars of German unification and beyond. By the early 20th century, the firm had become an industrial empire, with sprawling factories, tens of thousands of workers, and direct ties to the German military establishment. Krupp in World War I. When the First World War broke out in 1914, Krupp was ready. The company supplied Germany with massive artillery pieces, including the famous Big Bertha howitzer, which devastated Belgian fortresses in the early stages of the war. Krupp factories worked day and night to provide the Kaiser's armies with shells, guns, and equipment. But defeat in 1918 brought humiliation. The Treaty of Versailles specifically targeted Germany's arms industry, and Krupp was prohibited from producing heavy weapons. The empire that had thrived on war was suddenly shackled. Many of the company's facilities were idle, and the once proud arms manufacturer was reduced to civilian production. For the Krupp family, however, this was not the end. Instead, it was a period of quiet adaptation and preparation for the future. Circumventing Versailles. The interwar years were a time of struggle, but also of opportunity for Krupp. Officially barred from weapons production, the company shifted to producing locomotives, trucks, and other industrial goods. Yet behind the scenes, Krupp worked to circumvent the Versailles restrictions. Through secret partnerships and foreign subsidiaries, the company continued weapons development in violation of the treaty. Some of this research was conducted abroad, in Sweden and the Netherlands, where Krupp engineers quietly developed new artillery and tank designs. This clandestine work ensured that when the time came, Krupp would be ready to rearm Germany on a massive scale. Meanwhile, the Krupp name remained deeply respected in conservative and nationalist circles. The family maintained its reputation as patriotic industrialists, ready to serve the German nation when called upon again. The Nazi rise to power. That call came in 1933, when Adolf Hitler and the National Socialist Party seized power. For industrialists like Gustav Krupp von Bohlen and Halbach, the head of the family at the time, the rise of the Nazis was both a risk and an opportunity. Hitler promised to restore Germany's greatness, to overturn Versailles, and to rebuild the military. To do so, he needed allies in industry, companies that could produce weapons, vehicles, and machinery at scale. Krupp was the perfect partner. Almost immediately, the Nazis funneled enormous contracts to Krupp. The company was tasked with rearming the Wehrmacht in secret and at speed. In return, Krupp enjoyed lavish government support, guaranteed profits, and political protection. By the late 30s, Krupp factories in Essen and beyond were once again roaring with production. Cannons, tanks, and steel poured out of their gates. The family and its executives worked hand in hand with the Nazi leadership, seeing in Hitler the chance to restore their empire and their fortune. The Krupp philosophy. To understand Krupp's role in the Nazi state, it is important to note that the company did not see itself merely a private enterprise. For generations, the Krupp dynasty had cultivated the idea that they were servants of the German nation. Their weapons, their factories, even their workers, all were aligned with the goal of strengthening Germany's military power. This philosophy meshed seamlessly with Hitler's vision. Where the Nazis demanded rearmament, Krupp offered steel and cannons. Where the regime sought total war production, Krupp reorganized its factories to deliver. The bond between dictatorship and industry was not accidental. It was central to the Nazi war machine. Setting the stage for war. By 1939, on the eve of the Second World War, Krupp had fully returned to its former glory. Its massive plants employed tens of thousands. Its weapons were shipped directly to the Wehrmacht, and its leadership was firmly tied to Hitler's inner circle. The Ruhr, home to Krupp's Essen works, had become the beating industrial heart of Nazi Germany. From here, the regime could produce the steel, the guns, and the tanks needed for conquest. When German troops marched into Poland in September 1939, it was with Krupp cannons on their side. The stage was set. The world was about to witness the most destructive conflict in history, and Krupp, the steel giant of Essen, would be at the very center of it. When war erupted in September 1939, the Krupp Empire was already fully mobilized. Years of secret rearmament had positioned the company at the forefront of German military production. As the Wehrmacht surged into Poland, Krupp artillery fired the opening shots of the conflict. Within weeks, it became clear Krupp would be one of the central engines of Hitler's war. A giant at work. By 1939, Krupp's Essen complex was the largest industrial plant in Europe. It was often called a city within a city. The works sprawled across miles of land, with factories, forges, housing for workers, even its own hospitals and schools. More than 70,000 employees labored in Essen alone, producing everything from steel girders to high-precision guns. As German armies advanced, Krupp supplied them with the material of conquest: field guns, heavy artillery, armored vehicles, and munitions. Orders poured in at an unprecedented rate, and Krupp's output grew month by month. For the Krupp directors, this was the moment they had waited for since Versailles. The restrictions of 1919 were long gone. Now they were once again the arms merchants of Europe, only this time with the full backing of a totalitarian state. The first campaigns. The Blitzkrieg campaigns of 1939 and 1940 demonstrated the effectiveness of German military industry. In Poland, France, and the Low Countries, Krupp artillery and armor played a decisive role. Artillery. Krupp supplied the Wehrmacht with the reliable 105mm LFH howitzer and the massive 88mm gun, originally designed for anti-aircraft use, but soon infamous as an anti-tank weapon. Tanks. Although tank production was shared among several firms, Krupp provided components and designs, including turrets and armaments for the Panzer IV. Special projects. Krupp also revived its tradition of giant guns. Engineers began work on railway artillery and the colossal Schwere Gustav cannon, a 1,350-ton monster capable of firing shells weighing 7 tons. Every victory in 1939 and 1940 confirmed Krupp's importance. Hitler himself often praised the company, describing it as one of the Reich's indispensable pillars. The Krupp-Nazi relationship. The relationship between Krupp and the Nazi regime was more than business. It was political, personal, and ideological. Gustav Krupp, head of the family until the early 1940s, cultivated close ties with the Nazi leadership. He joined organizations that supported the regime and ensured Krupp factories followed Nazi labor and social policies. His son, Alfred Krupp, became increasingly influential as the war expanded, preparing to inherit the empire. For the Nazis, Krupp symbolized the union of tradition, industry, and nationalism. For the Krupps, Hitler represented the chance to restore their power and prestige. This alliance would prove fateful, binding the company to the crimes and conquests of the Third Reich. The Ruhr as fortress. The Ruhr region, home to Essen, became the industrial heart of Germany's war machine. Krupp, along with Thyssen, Hoesch, and other firms, transformed the Ruhr into an arsenal of total war. Steel from Krupp's furnaces fed into tanks, ships, and aircraft. The Allies would later call it the Arsenal of the Reich. Krupp's Essen plant produced not just weapons, but also the steel plate for submarines, locomotives for occupied territories, and components for fortifications. The scale was staggering. Hundreds of thousands of tons of steel flowed through Krupp every year. For the Allies, it was clear, to cripple Germany, they would eventually have to cripple Krupp. Life inside the factories. In the early war years, most Krupp workers were German. Many were long-time employees, loyal to the company, and proud of its history. Krupp had always cultivated a paternalistic relationship with its workforce, providing housing, welfare programs, and even sports clubs. But the war placed enormous demands on production. Shifts lengthened, quotas rose, and discipline tightened. Workers toiled day and night to meet military orders. Air raid sirens frequently interrupted shifts as British bombers probed German skies. Despite the strain, morale in 1940 remained high. Victories abroad seemed to justify the sacrifices at home, and Krupp employees often saw themselves as contributors to Germans' triumphs. Expansion through conquest. As German forces conquered new territories, Krupp expanded its reach. In occupied Poland, France, and the Low Countries, the company acquired factories, mines, and workshops. Some were seized outright, others were reorganized under German management. This expansion allowed Krupp to tap into resources and labor outside the Reich. Polish coal, French steel, Belgian machinery, all fed into Krupp's growing empire. The company became not just a German industrial titan, but a continental one, operating across occupied Europe. These conquests also foreshadowed darker practices to come. As German men were drafted into the Wehrmacht, the factories needed replacements. At first, foreign civilian workers were recruited, often under pressure. Soon, forced laborers would fill the assembly lines. Engineering prestige projects. The early victories also emboldened Krupp engineers to pursue ever more ambitious projects. Among these was the Schwere Gustav cannon, designed to destroy the strongest fortifications in Europe. Built in Krupp's workshops, the gun was so large it required a team of 1,400 men to assemble and operate. Although militarily inefficient, such prestige weapons symbolized the fusion of Nazi ambition and Krupp engineering. They were propaganda tools as much as instruments of war, demonstrating the might of German industry to both friends and foes. The road to the East. By 1941, Germany's attention turned to the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the USSR, would be the largest land campaign in history. For Krupp, it meant even greater demand for tanks, artillery, and shells. Factories worked at full capacity. Engineers modified tank turrets to combat Soviet armor. Artillery production soared. Contracts flowed directly from the Wehrmacht High Command to Krupp's boardrooms. The war was escalating to a scale never seen before, and Krupp was ready to supply it. Foreshadowing of what was to come. Yet beneath the triumph of the early war years, cracks were already forming. Labor shortages, resource bottlenecks, and the rising toll of war strained the system. To keep production running, Krupp and the regime would soon turn to darker measures: forced labor, exploitation, and the enslavement of prisoners of war and concentration camp inmates. But in 1940 and 1941, those measures still lay ahead. For now, Krupp was at the height of its power. Wealthy, productive, and inseparably tied to Hitler's conquests. The steel giant of Essen had become the beating heart of the Nazi war economy,
And as German tanks rolled eastward into the vastness of the Soviet Union, Krupp stood ready to forge the weapons of total war.
By 1942, the war had escalated into a conflict of unprecedented scale. Germany was fully engaged on the Eastern Front, fighting the Soviet Union in a brutal struggle for survival. At the same time, the war had become truly global, stretching from North Africa to the Atlantic, from Norway to the gates of Stalingrad. For the Nazi state, victory depended on one thing above all: industrial output. And at the center of this effort stood Krupp. The expansion of war production. In these years, Krupp reached the peak of its wartime production. Orders flooded in from the Wehrmacht, the Luftwaffe, and the Kriegsmarine. Tanks. Krupp produced turrets and guns for the Panzer IV, the backbone of the German armored forces, and contributed to the designs of newer tanks like the Tiger I. Artillery. The company's workshops turned out thousands of field guns and heavy artillery pieces. Krupp engineers refined existing designs to adapt to the changing battlefield, especially the threat of Soviet armor. Naval production. Krupp steel mills supplied armor plate for U-boats and warships. Without Krupp steel, the submarine campaign in the Atlantic would not have been possible. Special projects. Giant weapons like the Schwere Gustav and the Karl Gerät siege mortars were deployed, including during the siege of Sevastopol in 1942. The scale of production was staggering. Krupp employed over 100,000 workers across its empire, and the Essen plant roared day and night with the sound of furnaces, presses, and assembly lines. Total war and centralized control. In 1942, Joseph Goebbels declared total war. For Krupp, this meant even tighter integration into the Nazi war economy. The company's managers worked closely with Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, to streamline output. Speer's policies favored standardization, mass production, and ruthless efficiency. Krupp adapted quickly, reorganizing plants, cutting waste, and ramping up deliveries. The company was praised as a model of industrial discipline. But behind the numbers and quotas lay a darker reality. The labor force keeping these machines running was no longer drawn primarily from German workers. The turn to forced labor. By 1942, millions of German men had been drafted into the Wehrmacht. Industry faced severe shortages of skilled workers. The Nazi solution was forced labor. Krupp became one of the largest users of foreign and forced laborers in Germany. Men and women from occupied countries, France, the Netherlands, Poland, and the Soviet Union, were deported to the Reich and put to work in Krupp factories. Many arrived against their will, transported in cattle cars, treated as commodities rather than human beings. By 1943, more than half of Krupp's workforce consisted of foreigners and forced laborers. In Essen alone, tens of thousands lived in cramped barracks near the factory grounds. Their days were long, their food rations meager, their treatment harsh. Prisoners of war and concentration camp inmates. As the war dragged on, Krupp also employed prisoners of war, particularly Soviet POWs captured on the Eastern Front. They were treated with particular brutality, often starved, beaten, and denied medical care. Mortality rates were high. Even more sinister was Krupp's use of concentration camp inmates. Beginning in 1943, Krupp established satellite camps of nearby concentration camps, such as Buchenwald and Auschwitz. Thousands of inmates were forced to labor in Krupp armament factories. These men and women endured horrific conditions: 12-hour shifts, inadequate clothing, constant abuse from guards, and virtually no food. Many perished from exhaustion, disease, or outright murder. The use of slave labor became a defining feature of Krupp's wartime operations. Life in the camps and factories. Survivor testimonies paint a grim picture. Workers lived in overcrowded wooden barracks surrounded by barbed wire. At dawn, they marched under guard to the factories, where they worked in deafening, dangerous conditions. Injuries were common, and accidents often went untreated. By 1942, the war had escalated into a conflict of unprecedented scale. Germany was fully engaged on the Eastern Front, fighting the Soviet Union in a brutal struggle for survival. At the same time, the war had become truly global, stretching from North Africa to the Atlantic, from Norway to the gates of Stalingrad. For the Nazi state, victory depended on one thing above all: industrial output. And at the center of this effort stood Krupp. The expansion of war production. In these years, Krupp reached the peak of its wartime production. Orders flooded in from the Wehrmacht, the Luftwaffe, and the Kriegsmarine. Tanks. Krupp produced turrets and guns for the Panzer IV, the backbone of the German armored forces, and contributed to the designs of newer tanks like the Tiger I. Artillery. The company's workshops turned out thousands of field guns and heavy artillery pieces. Krupp engineers refined existing designs to adapt to the changing battlefield, especially the threat of Soviet armor. Naval production. Krupp's steel mills supplied armor plate for U-boats and warships. Without Krupp steel, the submarine campaign in the Atlantic would not have been possible. Special projects. Giant weapons like the Schwere Gustav and the Karl Gerät siege mortars were deployed, including during the siege of Sevastopol in 1942. The scale of production was staggering. Krupp employed over 100,000 workers across its empire, and the Essen plant roared day and night with the sound of furnaces, presses, and assembly lines. Total war and centralized control. In 1942, Joseph Goebbels declared total war. For Krupp, this meant even tighter integration into the Nazi war economy. The company's managers worked closely with Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, to streamline output. Speer's policies favored standardization, mass production, and ruthless efficiency. Krupp adapted quickly, reorganizing plants, cutting waste, and ramping up deliveries. The company was praised as a model of industrial discipline. But behind the numbers and quotas lay a darker reality. The labor force keeping these machines running was no longer drawn primarily from German workers. The turn to forced labor. By 1942, millions of German men had been drafted into the Wehrmacht. Industry faced severe shortages of skilled workers. The Nazi solution was forced labor. Krupp became one of the largest users of foreign and forced laborers in Germany. Men and women from occupied countries, France, the Netherlands, Poland, and the Soviet Union, were deported to the Reich and put to work in Krupp factories. Many arrived against their will, transported in cattle cars, treated as commodities rather than human beings. By 1943, more than half of Krupp's workforce consisted of foreigners and forced laborers. In Essen alone, tens of thousands lived in cramped barracks near the factory grounds. Their days were long, their food rations meager, their treatment harsh. Prisoners of war and concentration camp inmates. As the war dragged on, Krupp also employed prisoners of war, particularly Soviet POWs captured on the Eastern Front. They were treated with particular brutality, often starved, beaten, and denied medical care. Mortality rates were high. Even more sinister was Krupp's use of concentration camp inmates. Beginning in 1943, Krupp established satellite camps of nearby concentration camps, such as Buchenwald and Auschwitz. Thousands of inmates were forced to labor in Krupp armament factories. These men and women endured horrific conditions: 12-hour shifts, inadequate clothing, constant abuse from guards, and virtually no food. Many perished from exhaustion, disease, or outright murder. The use of slave labor became a defining feature of Krupp's wartime operations. Life in the camps and factories. Survivor testimonies paint a grim picture. Workers lived in overcrowded wooden barracks surrounded by barbed wire. At dawn, they marched under guard to the factories, where they worked in deafening, dangerous conditions. Injuries were common, and accidents often went untreated. German overseers and foremen enforced discipline with violence. Those who faltered were beaten. Those who resisted were sent back to concentration camps, where few survived. For Krupp executives, these workers were statistics, units of labor to be consumed for production. For the workers, it was a daily struggle for survival. Essen under bombs. Even as Krupp's factories pumped out weapons, they came under increasing threat from the skies. By 1942, the Allies had identified Essen as one of the most important industrial targets in Germany. The Royal Air Force launched repeated bombing raids on the city, and Krupp's plants were primary objectives. The air raids were devastating. Whole sections of Essen were flattened. The Krupp works were hit repeatedly, reducing some factories to rubble. By 1944, the war had entered its final and most destructive phase. Germany was under siege from all sides. The Red Army was pushing westward through Eastern Europe, the Western Allies had landed in Normandy, and the skies above the Reich were dominated by Allied bombers. For Krupp, once the proud symbol of German industrial might, these years brought relentless bombardment, crippling shortages, and finally, total collapse. The Allied bombing campaign intensifies. The city of Essen, home of Krupp's main works, became one of the most heavily bombed cities in Germany. Allied commanders recognized that destroying Krupp's factories would cripple Germany's war machine. The Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Forces launched wave after wave of bombing raids. By 1944, Essen endured hundreds of attacks. Night after night, bombers dropped tons of explosives and incendiaries on the city. Whole districts were leveled. Krupp's factories were primary targets. The giant workshops, furnaces, and machine halls were smashed again and again. Yet production never ceased entirely. Using forced labor, Krupp repaired damaged buildings, moved machinery underground, and dispersed operations to smaller sites in the surrounding region. Still, the toll was immense. Thousands of civilians and forced laborers were killed in the raids. Essen became a landscape of ruins, with the smoking remains of Krupp's empire standing at its center. The strain of forced labor. By 1944, the reliance on forced labor had reached its peak. At least 75,000 foreigners, prisoners of war, and concentration camp inmates were employed by Krupp. Many lived in camps directly adjacent to the factories, surrounded by barbed wire and guarded by SS men. The conditions deteriorated as the war dragged on. Food shortages grew acute, disease spread rapidly, and exhaustion claimed countless lives. Prisoners worked long shifts amid the rubble of bombed-out plants, clearing debris, carrying steel, or operating heavy machinery under constant danger. Testimonies from survivors describe Essen in these years as a hellscape. Bombs falling from above, guards beating from behind, hunger gnawing from within. For many, survival was a matter of luck. Krupp's role in armaments 1944 to 1945. Despite the chaos, Krupp continued to deliver weapons to the Wehrmacht. Tanks. Krupp supplied turrets for the formidable Tiger II tank, known as the King Tiger, one of the most powerful armored vehicles of the war. Artillery. The factories still turned out heavy guns, though in reduced numbers. Steel supply. Krupp Steel Works provided essential raw material for submarines and aircraft production until late 1944. But by 1945, output had plummeted. Allied air superiority, resource shortages, and transportation breakdowns made large-scale production impossible. Trains were bombed, coal supplies ran short, and raw materials from occupied territories dried up. The steel giant was staggering on its knees, kept alive only by the ruthless exploitation of labor and the determination of the Nazi leadership to fight to the bitter end. Alfred Krupp's final decisions. As head of the family empire, Alfred Krupp remained deeply involved until the very end. Even as Essen burned, he ordered reconstruction and pushed workers to meet impossible quotas. He continued agreements with the SS to supply labor from concentration camps, including Auschwitz. Inmates were transported under horrific conditions to Ruhr factories, where many perished within weeks. By 1945, Alfred Krupp had overseen the transformation of his company into a true war slave economy. The moral collapse of the firm was complete. The fall of Essen. In March and April 1945, the Allied advance reached the Ruhr. American and British forces encircled the region in what became known as the Ruhr Pocket. Hundreds of thousands of German troops surrendered. Essen, once the industrial heart of Germany, lay in ruins. Krupp's factories were shattered shells. The workforce scattered, many fleeing, many dead. The proud dynasty had become a symbol of destruction of the Nazi state and of German industry. On April 11, 1945, American troops entered Essen. They found a devastated city and crippled factories. The Krupp works, once the arsenal of the Reich, had been reduced to rubble. The arrest of Alfred Krupp. For Alfred Krupp, the collapse was personal as well as professional. On April 11th, the same day Essen fell, he was arrested by U.S. forces. He was taken into custody as a war criminal, accused of exploiting forced labor and sustaining the Nazi war effort. The Allies understood that to dismantle the Nazi system, it was not enough to capture generals and politicians. The industrialists, the men who armed Hitler, would also have to answer for their deeds. The symbolism of Krupp's fall. The destruction of Krupp had immense symbolic meaning. For decades, the Krupp dynasty had embodied German industrial power. Their cannons had fought at Sedan in 1870, at Verdun in 1916, and across Europe in 1940. Now, in 1945, the ruins of Essen symbolized the collapse of Hitler's empire. Yet the story of Krupp did not end in ruins. Unlike many of the Nazi elite, the Krupp family would survive and even rebuild. The reckoning, however, would come first. The path to judgment. In the months following Germany's surrender, Allied authorities gathered evidence against the leading figures of Nazi industry. At the top of the list was Alfred Krupp. He would soon stand trial in Nuremberg, accused of crimes against humanity for his role in exploiting slave labor and supplying Hitler's war. The world waited to see whether justice would finally reach the captains of industry who had fueled the most devastating conflict in human history.
With the fall of the Third Reich in May 1945, the world turned from battlefields to courtrooms. The Allies had vowed not only to defeat Nazi Germany militarily, but also to hold its leaders accountable. While generals and party officials faced justice, so too would the industrialists, the men whose factories had armed Hitler's armies and whose profits had been built on the backs of enslaved laborers. Among them stood Alfred Krupp von Bohlen und Halbach, heir to one of the most powerful dynasties in Germany. The industrialists on trial. The main Nuremberg trial, held in 1945-1946, focused on top Nazi leaders, Göring, Hess, Ribbentrop, and others. But the Allies also organized a series of subsequent trials to target other pillars of the Nazi system: doctors, judges, SS officers, and industrialists. The Krupp case was part of this effort. Officially known as the United States versus Alfred Krupp et al., it became one of the 12 follow-up trials conducted by American military tribunals in Nuremberg. The indictment charged Alfred Krupp and 11 other executives with crimes against humanity, war crimes, and membership in a criminal organization. At the heart of the case were two main accusations: the exploitation of forced and slave labor. Krupp had employed tens of thousands of prisoners of war and concentration camp inmates under inhumane conditions. The plunder of occupied territories. Krupp had seized factories, mines, and businesses in conquered lands, integrating them into its empire for profit. Alfred Krupp in the dock. When Alfred Krupp entered the courtroom in 1947, he was only 40 years old. Yet he carried the weight of his family's legacy and its crimes. Prosecutors portrayed him not as a reluctant participant, but as an eager collaborator. They argued that Alfred had personally overseen agreements with the SS to supply slave labor. He had signed documents authorizing the construction of camps, approved budgets for barracks, and visited factories where inmates toiled. The evidence was extensive. Testimonies from survivors described starvation rations, brutal treatment, and death by overwork. Documents traced directly to Alfred's office proved he had knowledge of and involvement in these practices. The defense strategy. Krupp's lawyers mounted a vigorous defense. They argued that Alfred had simply followed orders from the Nazi state, that refusal would have meant imprisonment or death. They claimed he had no direct control over the SS guards, and that his primary role was business administration. They also pointed to the chaos of wartime, bombings, shortages, and government interference. Krupp, they insisted, had done what was necessary to keep factories running, but he was not responsible for the crimes committed under Nazi authority. The defense tried to paint Alfred as a patriot, a businessman caught in the machinery of dictatorship. The judgment. The tribunal was not convinced. On July 31, 1948, Alfred Krupp was found guilty of crimes against humanity and war crimes. He was sentenced to 12 years in prison and the forfeiture of all his property. The ruling struck at the very heart of the Krupp dynasty. The empire, which had stood for over a century, was to be dismantled. The company's assets were placed under Allied control, and the family fortune was stripped away. It was one of the most dramatic blows delivered to any German industrialist. The significance of the Krupp verdict. The Krupp trial symbolized a larger truth. The Nazi war machine was not only built by soldiers and politicians, but by corporations. Without Krupp, IG Farben, Siemens, and other firms, Hitler's conquests would have been impossible. The verdict also underscored the principle that industry could not hide behind the excuse of just doing business. War profiteering, forced labor, and exploitation were not merely immoral, they were crimes under international law. Prison and aftermath. Alfred was sent to Landsberg prison, the same fortress where Hitler had written Mein Kampf decades earlier. Alongside other convicted industrialists, he served his sentence under American guard. But his imprisonment would not last the full 12 years. By the early 1950s, the Cold War had changed the political landscape. The United States, now facing off against the Soviet Union, sought to rebuild West Germany as a strong ally. That meant restoring its industrial capacity. In 1951, under American pressure, Alfred Krupp was released from prison after serving just 3 years. His property was returned and he was reinstated as head of the family firm. The supposed destruction of the Krupp Empire had lasted barely half a decade. The Krupp Empire restored. Upon his release, Alfred immediately set about rebuilding. Krupp factories, though battered, still stood. The Ruhr's industrial base was too important to dismantle completely. With Allied blessing, the company resumed production, this time for civilian goods and, increasingly, for the defense needs of the new West German state. The irony was unmistakable. A man convicted as a war criminal now once again controlled one of Germany's largest corporations. The Krupp name, tarnished though it was, endured. Legacy of the trial. The Krupp case left behind a complex legacy. On one hand, it marked a moment when the world held industrialists accountable for crimes against humanity. On the other, it revealed the limits of justice in a rapidly changing world order. For the survivors of forced labor, the trial offered recognition but little material compensation.
Many carried their scars for life, while the company that had enslaved them rose again within a few short years. For historians, the Krupp trial remains a key example of how business and war intertwine and how justice can be shaped by politics as much as by principle.
The fall of Nazi Germany in 1945 had brought devastation to the nation and disgrace to the Krupp family. Essen lay in ruins. Alfred Krupp had been convicted as a war criminal, and the family empire appeared finished. Yet within just a few years, the tides of history shifted. The Cold War turned enemies into allies, and once again, German industry was seen as essential, not for conquest, but for rebuilding and for standing against the Soviet Union. In this new world, the Krupp Company would rise again. The changing political climate. By the late 1940s, the political balance in Europe had changed dramatically. The former Allies were now divided, with the Soviet Union and the Western powers locked in ideological struggle. West Germany, formed in 1949, became a frontline state in the Cold War. For Washington and London, the priority was no longer punishment but recovery. A strong West German economy was seen as a bulwark against communism. Heavy industry, coal, steel, and machinery, was central to that recovery. And that meant Krupp could not remain dismantled forever. Alfred Krupp's release. In 1951, under mounting political pressure, the American High Commissioner for Germany, John J. McCloy, commuted Alfred Krupp's sentence. After serving just 3 years of his 12-year term, Alfred walked free. Even more extraordinary, his confiscated property was restored. The decision sparked outrage among survivors of Nazi forced labor and among some Allied officials. But for Cold War strategists, rebuilding Krupp was a practical necessity. Germany's economy needed its industrial titans. And so, within 6 years of his arrest, Alfred Krupp once again presided over his family empire. Rebuilding the company. Rebuilding was no small task. Essen had been bombed to rubble, and many factories lay in ruins. Yet enough remained to restart production. With financial aid from the Marshall Plan and political support from the new West German government, Krupp began producing steel, locomotives, and machinery once again. This time, the emphasis was on civilian goods. Construction steel for rebuilding cities, machinery for the growing automobile industry, and later, components for NATO defense contracts. By the mid-1950s, Krupp had returned to profitability. The name that had once been synonymous with Nazi weaponry was now rebranded as a symbol of Germany's Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle. Alfred's role in post-war Germany. Alfred Krupp kept a relatively low profile in the post-war years. Unlike his flamboyant predecessors, he avoided public speeches and rarely gave interviews. But behind the scenes, he wielded immense influence. He oversaw the modernization of the company, investing in new technologies and expanding into international markets. Krupp steel once again became a major export, supplying industries across Europe and beyond. At the same time, Alfred worked to rehabilitate the family name. He established charitable foundations, funded educational programs, and presented Krupp as a responsible corporate citizen of democratic West Germany. Yet the shadow of the past never disappeared. Survivors of forced labor continued to demand recognition and compensation. For decades, Krupp resisted these claims, denying direct responsibility and pointing to post-war political settlements. The moral question. The rebirth of Krupp posed a troubling question. How could a company so deeply implicated in Nazi crimes so quickly return to power? Critics argued that justice had been sacrificed for political expediency. The release of Alfred and the restoration of his fortune symbolized the triumph of Cold War pragmatism over accountability. For the victims, this was a bitter reality. Many former forced laborers lived in poverty, receiving little to no compensation, while Krupp prospered in the new West Germany. Krupp in the Cold War economy. As the Cold War deepened, Krupp became an important player in Western rearmament.
The company supplied steel and machinery not just for civilian reconstruction, but also for NATO defense projects. While Krupp never again built giant cannons or Nazi tanks, it did produce parts for modern military hardware, always under the oversight of democratic institutions. The irony was clear. The same factories that had once armed Hitler's armies were now contributing to the defense of the West against Stalin. Toward ThyssenKrupp. By the 1960s, Krupp was once again among the largest corporations in Germany. Yet changes were coming. Global competition, technological shifts, and the challenges of managing a family-owned industrial empire began to strain the company. In 1967, Alfred Krupp died without heirs. His vast fortune and the company shares were transferred to a charitable trust, the Alfred Krupp von Bohlen und Halbach Foundation, which remains one of the largest private foundations in Europe. In later decades, Krupp merged with Thyssen, another Ruhr giant, forming ThyssenKrupp, a global corporation that still bears the Krupp name today. The lasting shadow. Even as the company thrived in the post-war era, the legacy of wartime exploitation never faded. Survivors of forced labor fought for recognition well into the 1990s and 2000s. Under pressure, ThyssenKrupp eventually contributed to compensation funds for victims, but many argued it was too little too late. The story of Krupp became a symbol of Germany's broader struggle to reckon with its past, balancing economic success with moral responsibility. A tale of survival. In the end, the Krupp story after 1945 is one of remarkable survival. Few companies so deeply entangled in Nazi crimes managed not only to endure, but to flourish. That Krupp did so speaks to the power of political necessity, the pragmatism of the Cold War, and the enduring strength of German industry. But it also serves as a cautionary tale, a reminder of how easily business can become complicit in tyranny and how difficult it is to balance justice with geopolitics.
The story of Krupp is not only the story of a family or a company, it is the story of how industry, politics, and war can become inseparably intertwined. From the furnaces of Essen to the rubble of 1945, from the courtroom in Nuremberg to the boardrooms of post-war West Germany, Krupp embodied the rise, fall, and survival of German industry across one of history's darkest eras. The name that endured. Despite the destruction of the war and the disgrace of the trials, the name Krupp endured. Today, it lives on in the global corporation ThyssenKrupp, known for elevators, steel, and engineering projects worldwide. For many, the modern company represents innovation and German technical skill. Yet the shadow of the past is never far away. For those who know history, the name Krupp still conjures images of giant cannons, forced labor camps, and the complicity of business in Nazi crimes. It is a legacy both powerful and deeply conflicted. Memory and responsibility. Germany's post-war history has been marked by a profound effort to confront and acknowledge the crimes of the Nazi era. Memorials, education programs, and public debate have kept the memory of the Holocaust and forced labor alive. For Krupp, this reckoning has been more complex. The company contributed to compensation funds for forced labor victims, but critics argue that it took too long and gave too little. The survivors who suffered in Krupp's factories often died before seeing justice. Still, the acknowledgement itself matters. It stands as recognition that industry is not a neutral actor in times of dictatorship. It has choices, and those choices carry consequences. Industry and morality. The story of Krupp forces us to ask hard questions about the role of business in society. What responsibility do corporations have when governments commit crimes? Should profits take precedence over morality? Can industry claim neutrality when its products are weapons of oppression? Krupp answered these questions in the worst possible way during the Nazi era. It embraced dictatorship, exploited human beings as tools of production, and profited from conquest and slavery. The lesson is stark. Industry cannot wash its hands of politics. Neutrality in the face of tyranny is complicity. Survivors' voices. Perhaps the most important part of Krupp's legacy is not the factories or the steel, but the voices of those who suffered in its shadow. Survivors of forced labor have testified to the hunger, the violence, and the inhumanity they endured in Krupp's camps. Their stories remind us that behind every cannon, every tank, every piece of steel, there were human beings who paid the price. History is not only about machines and empires, it is about people. Krupp as a mirror of Germany. In many ways, the Krupp story mirrors Germany's own journey through the 20th century. Imperial ambition. The rise of Krupp in the 19th century paralleled the rise of the German Empire. Totalitarian complicity. Its role in Hitler's war mirrored Germany's descent into dictatorship. Collapse and ruin. Essen's destruction symbolized Germany's devastation in 1945. Rebirth and rehabilitation. The company's return during the Cold War reflected West Germany's economic miracle and reintegration into the world. Like the nation itself, Krupp carried both guilt and resilience, both disgrace and recovery. Lessons for the future. The story of Krupp remains relevant today, not only as history, but as a warning. Around the world, corporations continue to operate in environments where human rights are at risk. They face choices about whether to resist or collaborate, whether to prioritize ethics or profit. Krupp shows us what happens when industry chooses the latter. The short-term rewards may be great, but the long-term consequences, moral, historical, and human, are devastating. The weight of history. As we look back on Krupp's factories of war, the picture is clear. They were places of innovation and engineering brilliance, but also of suffering and death. They produced weapons that changed the course of battles, but they also consumed human lives as fuel for production. That duality, greatness and horror, achievement and atrocity, is what makes the Krupp story so important. It reminds us that progress without morality can become destruction, and that power without conscience can lead to catastrophe. A final reflection. Today, visitors to Essen can still see traces of the old Krupp works. Some of the factories have been demolished, others have been repurposed. The city has rebuilt, transformed from the arsenal of the Reich into a modern center of business and culture. But the echoes remain. The name Krupp still resonates, a reminder of both pride and shame, of survival and guilt. As historians, as citizens, as human beings, we are called to remember not only the battles and the leaders, but also the companies and the workers, the victims and the choices that shaped their fate. Krupp's factories of war stand as a warning carved in steel, that industry, unchecked and unprincipled, can become as deadly as any army.